Some questions
Yes.
for you? A question about the kamikazes. When did this particular fighting technique really start to make a difference, or did it really even make a difference in your mind in terms of the U.S. progress during the Pacific campaign?
In my view, the way I've always looked at World War II, the Germans were through. They had been defeated when we got a foothold in Normandy. The Soviets aren't going to be stopped. Even if they'd won the Battle of the Bulge in December of 44, it didn't matter. We were going to overwhelm them. The Japanese were through in midway. It was a turning point. But by 1943, we were going to win. It may take until 46, 47, I don't know how long, but it was going to go on. The kamikazes are a tactic. It comes back from the divine wind. It goes back to Chinese wars in the 1500s, well back into Japanese military history, the defeat of the Soviets, at that time, the Russians in 1905. We can hit them with such a ferocious attack that we will break their will. Remember thinking about bombing theory a little bit. Hey, we'll break the will. Well, this is breaking the military will. We will inflict so many losses that, they're going to get off this unconditional surrender call. They're going to call a truce, and on our terms, we can favorably end this war. And in the hopes of many, save the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and what they had gained. The kamikazes make their entrance. This had been thought about in the Japanese military for a while, but make their entrance really in the later stages of the Luzon campaign. And we get some ships hit in late 1944, and wow, they're deliberately crashing airplanes into our ships. Where it really came to the fore and actually made a difference, but it was not, again, going to be a turning point where, we've lost 5,000 sailors. We've lost 30 plus ships. We've had hundreds damaged. We had ships that had to retire to the west coast of the United States if they could actually make it for repairs. But we could keep turning out ships and sailors, and we were going to overcome this. The actual invasion of Japan was largely predicated on kamikaze forces. The Japanese response, which would have been midget submarines, torpedoes, basically manned, aircraft, all the rest of their aircraft at the end of the war, and their fuel supplies were being saved for this one last hit the Americans hard, and they're going to back off because we know they don't like a lot of casualties. The American public is not a group that will take massive numbers of body bags coming home. 300,000 in World War II was enough, but are we willing to take another 100,000, 200,000 invading the home islands? The Japanese were banking that wouldn't happen. And the kamikazes, if you don't mind giving up your life, as we have seen the last 10, 15 years in Southwest Asia, a person who's committed to giving up his life is a very, very dangerous and difficult to overcome weapon.
So do you think that the use of kamikazes was driven, or how much of it was driven by the sort of cutting down on the Japanese resources? Lack of training of pilots, because you could fly and hit a ship a lot more easily than you could fly and come back.
Even rudimentary training, and many of these were trained basically on we move the stick, and this makes the airplane go up and down, and this makes it roll. That's kind of the training, because as you say, all I got to do is fly out there. If you're fast and small, and you got a lot of them, and the tactics were generally not, well, you fly off today, and hey, a couple hours, you can and take off. No, it's put 400 airplanes up or something and overwhelm the radar coverage, overwhelm the fighter defenses, overcome the gun control directors on the fleet, and something's going to get through. So yes, to me, I think to our Western way of thinking, the bonsai charge, the kamikazes, these are phenomenal wastes of manpower, but looking at it from their perspective, if I achieve the overall strategic goal of cutting my losses and getting out of this thing, probably worthwhile. Besides, the Japanese military code was completely different than what we in the West know. Surrender, you don't do that sort of thing. Dying for the emperor, this is good. There's a long psychological history on this, and you can read about it. But it was a whole different thinking paradigm that went behind the Japanese. The ferocity of their attacks, the willingness to give up their entire garrison to the last man.
So, transitioning into that, when the U.S. started and the other allies started to move into the Pacific, how prepared were they for this fighting style? Did it take them completely by surprise, or did they have an inkling this was coming?
Yeah, I think most of it came as a pretty brutally learned surprise. Guadalcanal, again, the Marines learned a phenomenal amount about, wow, this is not an easy enemy to tackle. This is not what we studied at Camp Lejeune or the West Coast of the United States. These people are in it, and they're in it all the way, and they are tough, and they are trained, and they can live off the land on a lot less than the American soldier or Marine is trained to live on. The Army found it out in Philippines, of course, at the start, but from an offensive position in New Guinea. MacArthur's troops had to adapt to that same ferocity, the Japanese tenacity to hold, to kill, to overwhelm. It was, yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. The kamikaze, wow,
yeah.
we would never think of doing that in the West. The deliberate crashing of an airplane, the deliberate sailing of the great battleship Yamato out to tackle the fleet at Okinawa, which I didn't cover, but it was a one-way suicide mission, and most every sailor on board the mightiest battleship in the world went down under the ferocity of this overwhelming U.S. attack capability. But we did it through firepower and not manpower. The Japanese, the Russians, the Chinese in the Korean War exhibited that trading off manpower wasn't as big a problem as it is for us.
So do you think that as the U.S. military command started to get a sense of the potential resistance from the Japanese troops as they moved from island to island, did their estimates of the cost of invading Japan change as a result of those experiences?
Yeah, I think throughout the campaign, not just the upcoming Operation Downfall, but hey, as best you can intelligence-wise, you try to figure out what's the enemy got here on the object of the military exercise. We didn't do necessarily a great job on some of them. Okinawa had a lot more people. Kyushu would have had far more than the intelligence estimates had it. But we had a pretty fair idea of the casualties you'd pick up. I think Tarawa certainly was the eye-opener. Wow, you know, one thing on Guadalcanal, which is a fairly good-sized island as islands go, but Tarawa, it's this little nothing atoll thing down there that you could walk across in a couple of minutes. And that cost us 76 hours of fighting and hundreds of dead. Wow, I think we had better, first off, change tactics, more naval gunfire. Again, overwhelming firepower. Send in airplanes, and the Japanese counter to that, of course, is dig in. and the Germans were good at this sort of thing as well. But in the Pacific, a phenomenal number of fortresses where they'd had years to prepare some of these islands, and huge, or the topographical nature of the islands. And the Marianas, for example, they're huge cave formations. Go into caves all over the U.S. and you'll get an idea of what some terrain looks like. If it's just full of holes that you can hide in, you can blast away on the surface all you want. And when they're all done firing their 1-ton shells and their 500-pound shells and dropping their bombs and having a great display of fireworks, you crawl out of your hole with your weapon, and in a concealed environment, you're ready to do battle with the enemy. We found that, and every island that got probably tougher and tougher. The Japanese were good at adapting the terrain, and again, they're willing to take, if I hold this ground, I'm going to die, but I'm going to take 10 Americans with me. That was the kind of philosophical thing, and the ferocity then got matched in many ways from our side. Much of what I guess we would consider the norms of war, the Geneva Convention, the niceties of the legal principles of war, if you will, ferocity met ferocity. It was an uglier campaign than what you had in Europe in general.